My granddaughter said it gently, the way young people talk to the elderly when they think kindness can hide their disbelief. "Grandma, you're too old to travel," she said, with a small smile that stung more than any insult could. The room was full of approving nods, my son pretending to soften the blow. "She only worries about you, Mom. It's not safe out there." I laughed as if they were right, but something sharp moved beneath my ribs, a pulse of humiliation mixed with a grief so old it almost felt familiar. I live alone now in a small coastal town, the kind where the ocean hums against the rocks, and everyone knows when your curtains are open or closed. My house is tidy, too quiet, with the faint smell of salt and furniture polish. Some mornings I make 2 cups of coffee by accident, one for me and one for the memory of the man who used to drink it beside me. It's an ordinary life, peaceful and airless at once. I thought I had made peace with it until that day when my own family looked at me as if I were a delicate problem wrapped in skin, something to be protected from itself. After they left, their laughter lingering like perfume, I sat in my chair by the window and tried to let the words roll off me. But they didn't roll. They stuck. Too old. The phrase kept echoing, attaching itself to everything I did. When I opened the fridge, when I folded laundry, when I turned on the TV and saw people half my age climbing mountains, swimming in frozen seas, dancing barefoot in festivals under foreign skies. I used to be one of them, not famous, not daring, but curious enough to move. In my 20s, I slept on trains through Europe, once got lost in Lisbon, and ended up in a parade, laughing with strangers until dawn. I met my husband in Morocco when my camera broke, and he offered to fix it with a pocket knife. For 40 years after that, we traveled whenever we could. Cheap flights, small hotels, notebooks full of stamps, and sand pressed between pages. Then he died, and the world folded in half. I told myself I'd travel again someday, when the grief stopped feeling like an unpaid debt. But years passed, and the edges of that promise grew dull, until that afternoon when my granddaughter's voice cut through the dullness like a small, merciless bell. It wasn't cruelty. That's what made it unbearable. Cruelty. I could fight, but pity is heavier. Pity is what locks you inside your own house with the blinds drawn. I watched them drive away, their car bright and clean, their lives busy and important. I could still hear their warnings in my head. Too old, too dangerous, too tiring. The words sounded like weather reports for a life that had already ended. I made dinner, ate half of it, left the rest to cool. Then I opened the drawer where I keep the old maps. The paper had yellowed, the corners curled. I ran my hand over the names of places, Reykjavik, Kyoto, Cusco, like touching old friends. My fingers stopped at Iceland, a country I'd once dreamed of but never reached. I remembered reading about its silence, its light, the way the sky there burns green in winter. For years I told myself it was too far, too cold, too impractical. That night, practicality felt like another word for surrender. I went online, squinting through my reading glasses, and typed flights to Reykjavik. The search results glowed like forbidden fruit. I hesitated, not because of fear, but because I realized I had no one to tell, no one to ask permission from. The absence of witnesses made the decision feel almost sacred. I closed the tab and sat very still. The house was silent except for the sound of the clock ticking above the fridge, each second an accusation. I thought of all the times I'd deferred my own desires, when the children were small, when money was short, when someone else's needs seemed more urgent. I had been sensible all my life, and what had sensibility given me except other people's comfort? I stood up, went to the mirror, and looked at myself. Not kindly, not cruelly, just honestly. My hair is white, my shoulders a little stooped, but my eyes are still steady. There was a spark there I hadn't seen in years. I went to the closet and pulled out my old travel bag, the leather one with worn handles. It smelled of dust and citrus oil. Inside were relics, a plug adapter, a folded itinerary from 1997, a train ticket from Paris. I traced the faded ink and smiled. The bag looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe I had simply filled it with too many excuses. I left it on the bed, open, like an invitation. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house sounded like a question. What are you waiting for? Around 3 a.m, I made tea and sat by the window. Outside, the ocean shimmered under a thin moon, restless, infinite, alive. It occurred to me that the sea never wonders if it's too old to move. The next morning, I dressed carefully, as if for an appointment with my former self. I put on the navy coat my husband bought me years ago, the one with the deep pockets and the stubborn zipper. At the bank, the clerk recognized me. "Going somewhere nice?" she asked, glancing at the withdrawal slip. I smiled. "I hope so." My hands didn't tremble when I signed the paper. In the travel agency, the same one where I booked our honeymoon half a century ago, the young man behind the desk offered me coffee while his computer hummed. When he asked for my destination, I said, "Iceland." He looked surprised, then impressed. "Alone?" "Yes," I said, "entirely." When he printed the ticket and slid it toward me, I felt the same surge I'd once felt at 20, that quiet explosion of possibility. At home, I placed the ticket on the kitchen table, beside the teapot. The sunlight fell across it, making the ink gleam. I waited for the usual wave of guilt, to call my son, to justify myself, but it didn't come. Instead, a calmness settled in. Perhaps defiance at my age isn't about shouting or slamming doors. It's about buying a plane ticket without apologizing. I began to pack slowly, methodically. Not the clothes they'd expect. No beige sweaters or orthopedic shoes. I packed the red scarf from Florence, the black notebook from Kyoto, the silver pendant my husband once said caught light like courage. Every item felt like a statement. I'm still here. By evening, the suitcase was ready, and I sat beside it eating a simple dinner, listening to the sound of waves hitting the shore. I thought about what my granddaughter might say when she found out. Perhaps she'd roll her eyes, call me reckless, or maybe, though this was too much to hope, she'd be proud. I realized I didn't need her approval any more than I needed permission. Age doesn't erase the self. It only makes the layers thicker, harder to read from the outside. Beneath the wrinkles, the same pulse beats. When I finally went to bed, I placed the passport under my pillow like a secret. Sleep came slowly, full of strange, bright dreams, mountains of ice, skies on fire, voices calling my name in languages I didn't understand. Morning light woke me before the alarm. I sat up, heart steady, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like someone's leftover. I felt like a traveler again, poised at the threshold between fear and freedom. They said I was too old to travel. Maybe I am, but I would rather be lost in a foreign airport with my heart racing than safe in a living room where nothing new ever happens. And perhaps when my granddaughter sees the pictures one day, the glacier, the aurora, the stubborn old woman grinning into the wind, she'll understand that I didn't go away to prove them wrong. I went to remember who I was before they started calling me old. The defining act of betrayal didn't arrive as a thunderclap. It came disguised as kindness, the kind that presses your shoulders down while smiling. The day after I told my family I was thinking about visiting Iceland, my son invited me to lunch. He chose one of those neat restaurants where every dish looks like a photograph and conversation feels supervised. Chloe was there too, and so was her mother, my daughter-in-law, who ordered salad without looking at the menu and kept her phone on the table as if waiting for an excuse to leave. I should have known something was coming from the way they kept exchanging looks, the small conspiratorial nods people use when they're about to intervene. My son began gently, telling me how wonderful it was that I still had dreams, how inspiring. I heard the but long before it arrived. "But Mom," he said, "we just think it might be risky, you know. You could slip or get confused with the currency. And if something happened to you, we'd never forgive ourselves." His wife added, "Why not join a senior group tour? They handle everything for you. You just have to show up." She said it like she was offering mercy, not erasure. I smiled, stirring my tea, watching the lemon slice turn circles in the cup. "You think I can't manage a map?" I asked quietly. My son sighed the way he used to when I reminded him to wear sunscreen, indulgent and weary. "It's not about that. It's just, you don't know how different things are now. Airports, apps, all that. It's complicated." He didn't notice that the tone he used with his teenage daughter had now become the one he used for me. Chloe chimed in, eager to help. "Grandma, we can plan something fun together instead. Maybe a family cruise with all of us. You'd have company." She looked proud of her solution, as if she'd solved an equation. I looked at her young face and felt an ache that wasn't anger, but something sadder, an awareness that she had inherited the same quiet arrogance the world teaches the young. That age is a decline, not a continent of its own. I thanked them for their concern. I even agreed to think about the cruise. But as I watched them eat, each movement practiced and brisk, I realized they didn't see me at all. They saw a collection of potential disasters. A lost passport, a fall on the stairs, a missed flight. They talked about me as though I were already gone. My son began listing news stories about tourists who vanished or were scammed. My daughter-in-law mentioned insurance policies, medical coverage, liability forms. The words blurred into a single hum of caution. I sat back, smiled, and let them build their protective cage wire by wire. When the waiter came, I ordered dessert. None of them did. I ate it slowly, tasting the rebellion in every bite of dark chocolate. That evening, when I returned home, the house greeted me with its usual silence. The chair by the window, the faint smell of salt, the sound of waves breaking somewhere beyond the street. I took off my shoes and sat on the floor beside my travel bag. I had unpacked it the night before, convinced I'd made a foolish impulse. But now, surrounded by the echo of their laughter, I zipped it open again. Inside lay the folded itinerary and the ticket to Reykjavik. I touched the paper, fragile and absolute. It was proof that at least once I had chosen myself. Then, without much thought, I opened my phone and scrolled through messages. There was one from my son. "We'll send you some info about senior travel groups. Don't do anything rash." I read it twice and deleted it. For a few days, I said nothing. I let the air settle. I visited the library, returned a book I hadn't finished, and took out another on glaciers and volcanoes. The librarian, a woman about my age, asked if I was planning a trip. "Just reading," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, they tasted false. That night I studied the photos, endless white landscapes, small houses against horizons of ice, people bathing in blue water that steamed like breath. I tried to picture myself there and failed, not because I couldn't imagine it, but because I was afraid of how much I wanted it. The wanting felt dangerous, like holding a match near dry paper. The next morning, I received an email from Chloe. She'd booked the family cruise. "We'll stop in the Bahamas and maybe Mexico. I got you a cabin near us, so you won't get lost." There was a smiley face at the end, innocent, confident. I stared at it for a long time before replying, "That sounds lovely, sweetheart. I'll think about it." Then I closed my laptop, took the envelope with my ticket, and placed it inside my coat pocket, where my heart beat slow and stubborn. 2 days later, I went for a walk along the harbor. The weather had turned sharp, the sky metallic. Boats swayed in their moorings like restless thoughts. I passed a group of tourists taking photos of gulls and realized I was jealous of their oblivion, their easy right to wander. Near the pier, a travel agency had set up a small outdoor stand advertising Northern Lights packages. A young woman handed me a brochure. "It's the perfect time to go," she said. "Winter light, fewer crowds." Her breath formed small clouds in the air. "You should do it." She didn't mean to challenge me, but the words struck like a spark. I smiled. Maybe I will. When I got home, I printed the confirmation of my flight. The sound of the printer was absurdly loud in the quiet house. I folded the papers neatly and slid them into the back of my passport. Then I sat down and waited for the wave of guilt that always follows my moments of courage. It didn't come. Instead, I felt an odd stillness, as if the room itself were listening. I understood suddenly that the betrayal at that lunch wasn't new. It was the final note in a song they'd been humming for years. Every time they'd told me to rest, to let them handle things, to be careful, each phrase had shaved off a piece of me until only the outline remained. What hurt wasn't their intention to protect me. It was their certainty that I needed protecting. That night, the phone rang. It was my son again, his voice tight, polite. "Mom, we've been thinking. Maybe it's better if you don't travel right now. The weather's unpredictable, and you're not as quick on your feet these days." I listened, hearing not fear, but ownership. "I appreciate your concern," I said, "but I'm going." He paused. "Going where?" "Somewhere you've never been." Before he could answer, I wished him good night and hung up. My hands were steady. I poured a glass of water, drank it slowly, and looked at the reflection in the kitchen window. The woman there looked older than I remembered, but clearer, as if the fog had finally lifted. The next morning I packed again, this time with purpose. I printed copies of my travel insurance, made a list of medications, left a note on the fridge that said simply, "Don't worry." It wasn't permission, it was closure. Outside, gulls screamed over the harbor, and the air smelled of rain. I felt the first true flutter of fear then, not of flying or falling, but of freedom. I realized how long I had been waiting for someone to grant me permission to live. The betrayal I saw now wasn't theirs alone. It was mine too, for accepting the smallness they offered me. When I boarded the taxi to the airport 2 days later, I didn't look back at the house. I had dusted the shelves, watered the plants, left the curtains open. If I didn't come back, it would look as though I had simply stepped out into the sunlight. At the airport, the woman at the check-in counter asked if I needed assistance. I told her no, though my knees ached and my suitcase felt heavier than reason. She printed the boarding pass and smiled. "Enjoy your adventure." The words settled over me like a blessing. I carried it through security, through the long corridor that smelled of coffee and disinfectant, through the gate where other passengers waited with their devices and distractions. When the clouds swallowed the view, and for a moment I was suspended between two worlds, the one that wanted to keep me safe and the one that waited for me to arrive. I followed the slow-moving line of passengers through customs, clutching my passport like an anchor. The young officer at the booth looked up, smiled, and said, "Welcome." One word, simple, but it landed inside me like warmth after a long winter. I was here, entirely alone, with no one waiting, no one to check whether I'd found my seat or packed my medication. It was terrifying, and it was magnificent. My knees wobbled as I dragged my suitcase into the arrivals hall, where the air smelled faintly of cold coffee and rain. I stood for a moment, scanning the signs, trying to remember how to be the kind of woman who knows where she's going. The first mistake came quickly. I had booked what I thought was a small hotel near the harbor, but the address I copied from the confirmation email was wrong by a single digit. The taxi driver, kind but limited in English, dropped me outside a warehouse district that looked deserted. The snow on the ground was packed into gray ridges, and a cold wind slipped under my coat. For a few minutes I stood there, disoriented, considering the possibility that my family had been right after all. Then, from behind me, a woman's voice asked if I was lost. She was young, wearing a knit hat and carrying a paper bag full of groceries. When I showed her the address, she smiled and pointed. "Wrong side of the harbor," she said, drawing a little map on the back of my itinerary with a blue pen. Her handwriting looped like ocean waves. She even called a cab for me. I thanked her, and she shrugged. Happens to everyone. The words were small, but merciful. They gave me back my dignity. The second taxi driver took me to the right hotel, a modest gray building tucked behind a seafood cafe. The lobby smelled of cinnamon and wet wool. The man at the desk handed me a brass key and said, "Room 3, upstairs." My room was small, with a single window overlooking the harbor, the kind of view that made you forgive the thin mattress and the occasional rattle of pipes. I unpacked slowly, placing my clothes in the narrow wardrobe, arranging my toothbrush beside the sink, as if these gestures could convince the room to accept me. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the quiet. It wasn't empty. It hummed with something alive. That night, jet lag kept me awake. I made tea from the little packets beside the kettle and watched the lights of the harbor flicker against the dark water. At home, I would have turned on the television for company. Here, I let the silence stay. The next morning, I joined a small walking tour. There were 8 of us, mostly younger couples, all wearing bright jackets that made them look like migrating birds. The guide, a tall woman with a red scarf, introduced herself as Freya and handed out maps. When she asked where everyone was from, I said North Carolina, and a few people smiled politely. No one asked why I was alone. The tour began in the old town, winding through narrow streets lined with colorful houses that looked as if they'd been painted just to cheer up the sky. I tried to keep up, but my pace was slower, and soon I found myself at the back of the group. I didn't mind. It gave me time to notice the small things, the smell of baked bread from a cafe, the way the snow melted in delicate patterns on the roofs, the laughter of 2 children sliding down a small hill on plastic trays. Everything felt both foreign and familiar, like a language I once knew but had forgotten how to speak. At lunch, we stopped in a cafe with steamed windows and wooden tables. I ordered soup, thick with fish and potatoes, and when the guide came by to check on us, she said, "You remind me of my grandmother. She travels all the time." It wasn't patronizing. It was admiration. I smiled, and for the first time since landing, I felt visible in a way that didn't sting. In the afternoon, the weather changed suddenly. The sky darkened, and wind whipped through the streets. The guide announced that we'd need to return by bus because the storm was coming in faster than expected. The bus, however, never arrived. We huddled under an overhang near a church, the group buzzing with nervous energy. Freya went to make calls, and I saw panic flicker across her face when the signal cut out. The young couple beside me whispered about missing their dinner reservation. I pulled from my bag the thermos of tea I'd packed that morning and poured cups for whoever wanted them. The steam rose between us like a small act of defiance. The group calmed. Someone started telling stories about getting stranded in airports, and soon laughter replaced worry. Freya returned, shaking her head but smiling now. "Another bus is coming," she said. "You're all very calm." I shrugged. "We've all been through worse storms, just different kinds." When we finally made it back to the harbor, the snow had thickened into soft sheets, blurring the outlines of everything. I stood at the edge of the pier, watching the flakes dissolve in the dark water. My legs ached, and my face stung from the wind, but inside, something had shifted. Fear had turned into a kind of exhilaration. I was cold, exhausted, slightly lost, and profoundly alive. That night, I returned to my room, peeled off the wet layers, and lay down without turning on the light. Outside, the wind howled against the window, and I thought about all the times in my life when I'd chosen safety over wonder. My son's voice echoed in my head, soft and reasonable. "It's not safe out there." But safety, I realized, had been the slowest kind of death. I fell asleep to the sound of the storm, the world rearranging itself beyond the glass. The next morning, the city looked reborn. The streets sparkled, the rooftops glistened, and the air smelled clean enough to drink. I walked without a map, letting instinct guide me. I found a small bookstore tucked between two houses, its window filled with postcards. Inside, a bell rang as I entered. The shopkeeper, a man with gray hair and kind eyes, greeted me in Icelandic, then switched to English when he saw my confusion. "Looking for something?" he asked. "A story," I said, surprising myself. He nodded as if that were a perfectly ordinary request and handed me a small book of poems by an Icelandic writer I'd never heard of. The cover showed a woman standing alone under a sky of green light. I bought it and tucked it into my coat pocket. Later that day, I took a bus to the outskirts of the city where the landscape opened up. Endless white fields, black rocks, distant mountains. I got off at a stop without knowing exactly why. There was a small path leading toward the shore, and I followed it until I reached the water. The sea here was darker, heavier than the one at home. I stood there for a long time, letting the wind push against me, testing my balance. I thought of my husband, of the way he used to stand at the edge of waves and throw his arms wide, daring the world to move him. I whispered his name into the wind and felt the syllables carried away, not lost but transformed. When I returned to the hotel that evening, the clerk handed me a message slip. "Someone called from America," he said. My heart stumbled. "Did they leave a number?" "No, just said to tell you they love you." I thanked him and went upstairs, the paper trembling in my hand. I knew it wasn't my son. That wasn't his way. It must have been Chloe. I placed the note on the nightstand and stared at it. For a moment, I felt the pull, the urge to call, to reassure, to explain. But then I looked at the window where the faint glow of the northern lights shimmered like breathing. I turned off the lamp, lay back, and let the green light wash over me. In the following days, I settled into a rhythm. I took long walks, visited museums, sat in cafes watching strangers. No one looked at me with pity. People asked where I was from, not who I belonged to. The small freedom of being anonymous was intoxicating. I wrote in my notebook each night, not about what I saw, but about what I felt returning. curiosity, humor, patience, courage. On the 5th day, I booked a day trip to the countryside. The bus wound through valleys and past frozen waterfalls. I sat near the window, watching the landscape change from ice to moss to lava fields that looked like the surface of another planet. At one stop, the guide offered us the chance to soak in a geothermal spring. I hesitated, self-conscious about my aging body among the smooth-skinned youth around me. But then an older woman in a red swimsuit laughed, threw her towel aside, and stepped into the steaming water without hesitation. "Come," she called. "It's like being born again." So I did. The water was hotter than I expected, almost painful at first, but then the warmth seeped into every joint, every ache, until I felt weightless. Around me, steam rose, blurring faces into ghosts. I closed my eyes and floated, my heart steady, my breath deep. For the first time in years, I felt not old or young, but timeless. When I stepped out, the air bit at my wet skin, sharp and real. I wrapped myself in the towel and laughed out loud, softly, but enough to startle the young man beside me. He grinned back, not mocking, just surprised. "First time here?" he asked. "First time anywhere," I said. That night I returned to the city, tired, but filled with a quiet triumph. In the hotel mirror, I saw a face I recognized, not the one my family saw, lined with years and fragility, but the one that used to look back at me before life became a series of polite concessions. I touched the mirror gently and whispered, "You're still here." Then I wrote one line in my notebook before bed. "Fear is a leash. I have slipped it." The days that followed passed in a calm blur. Each morning, I chose a direction and walked until my legs protested, stopping only for coffee or soup. Sometimes I got lost, and that no longer scared me. Getting lost was its own kind of orientation. I learned how to buy bus tickets, how to say thank you in Icelandic, how to read the sky for weather. The world, it turned out, hadn't closed itself to me. I had closed myself to it. And now, step by step, I was opening again. The midpoint of my journey did not announce itself with any grand revelation or dramatic sunrise. It arrived quietly, like a tide that had been rising all along without my noticing. I had been in Iceland for a little over a week, long enough for the hotel clerk to greet me with a nod of familiarity, long enough for the barista at the cafe near the harbor to know I preferred my coffee with milk and no sugar, long enough for me to stop thinking of myself as a visitor and start behaving like someone who belonged, if only temporarily. The first shock of independence had faded, replaced by something steadier, calmer, more interior. I woke each morning to the thin northern light filtering through the curtains and the distant sound of gulls, and I felt neither lonely nor lost. I felt awake in a way that had eluded me for years. On the 9th day, I joined another small tour, this time to the south coast, a place of waterfalls and black sand beaches. The bus was half full, the passengers a mix of young travelers with cameras and older couples dressed in matching raincoats. I sat near the back, content to watch rather than converse. The landscape unfolded in long, deliberate gestures. Plains of moss the color of old gold, cliffs streaked with ice, farmhouses standing alone like punctuation marks in an unfinished poem. Every few miles, the driver would slow down, point out some geological wonder, and I would stare out the window feeling both infinitesimal and infinite at once. It struck me that this was what I had been missing, the sensation of being small without being diminished. At our first stop, a waterfall that thundered down a cliffside like a living heartbeat, I lingered longer than the rest. The mist clung to my coat, my hair, my eyelashes. A young woman offered to take my picture, and I almost refused, then changed my mind. I stood with the falls behind me, not posing, but simply existing. When she showed me the result, I barely recognized the expression on my face. Not forced or dutiful, but quietly certain. A woman anchored in her own presence. I thanked her and she smiled. "You look like someone who's been waiting to arrive," she said. Her accent softened the words, made them sound like poetry. Later, on the bus, she sat beside me. Her name was Amira, from Spain, traveling alone as well. She was 30, maybe less, her energy bright but tinged with something restless. We spoke easily, perhaps because there was no obligation to impress. She told me she had left a job she hated, sold her car, and decided to travel until she ran out of courage or money. I told her I had left behind something less tangible, permission, the invisible leash of other people's expectations. She laughed, saying, "That's harder to sell than a car." During the long ride to the next stop, we shared stories, the places we'd dreamed of, the people we'd disappointed, the small triumphs that no one else noticed. When she asked if I missed my family, I hesitated, then said, "I miss the idea of them, not the reality." She nodded as if she understood. At the black sand beach, the wind was fierce, dragging ribbons of mist across the ground. Waves crashed with a violence that was both frightening and mesmerizing. Amira ran toward the surf, her coat billowing, her laughter torn to pieces by the wind. I stayed back, watching her silhouette against the gray sea, and for a moment I saw my younger self in her, the girl who once chased waves in Morocco, who wasn't afraid of being cold or foolish. Without quite realizing it, I followed her, my shoes sinking into the wet sand, the wind pushing against me. When I reached her, she shouted something I could barely hear, something about how alive it felt to stand where the world ended and began again. I shouted back, "It's never too late to start over." The words surprised me as they left my mouth, but they felt true. She grabbed my hand briefly, squeezed it, and we both laughed until the cold drove us back to the bus. That evening, back at the hotel, I couldn't shake the sensation that something inside me had shifted again, not in a burst, but like a hinge easing open. I took off my coat and hung it carefully by the door, then caught sight of myself in the mirror. My hair was tangled, my cheeks red from the wind, and I looked, for lack of a better word, vivid. I made tea, opened the small book of Icelandic poems I'd bought earlier, and read one at random. She remembers the river, but forgets the shore, and so she keeps walking. I underlined the line with a pen. That night, before I fell asleep, I wrote in my journal, "I am not here to escape. I am here to return to myself." The following days took on a rhythm that felt almost sacred. I woke early, walked through the city before the shops opened, and watched the world stretch itself awake. Sometimes I stopped at a small bakery for bread still warm from the oven. I talked to strangers who would forget me by tomorrow, and somehow that anonymity made me more honest. I began sketching again, small pencil drawings of buildings, boats, faces glimpsed in passing. My hands, stiff from years of neglect, began to remember their old confidence. There was no plan, no goal beyond being fully present, and that was enough. Then one afternoon, while exploring a small village outside the city, I wandered into a community hall where a group of locals were setting up for a concert. A man in his 60s, with a beard like frost, asked if I wanted to stay. I hesitated, then said yes. I sat in the back as they played folk songs I didn't understand, but felt deeply. The music filled the wooden hall with something ancient and tender. I watched the faces around me, farmers, children, tourists, and realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't performing any version of myself. I wasn't the mother, the widow, the grandmother. I was just a woman listening to music in a place where no one knew my name, and it was enough to make my eyes sting. After the concert, I stepped outside into the evening chill. The sky was painted in streaks of violet and pale blue, the light lingering longer than seemed possible. The bus back to the city wouldn't come for an hour, so I walked toward the edge of the village, where a small lake reflected the sky like glass. I sat on a bench, my breath forming clouds. A dog trotted up and sat at my feet, uninvited but welcome. I scratched its head and thought about my life waiting back home, my house, the neat order of things, the voices that told me what was sensible. The thought didn't fill me with guilt or longing, only clarity. I whispered to the dog, "I think I've been living half asleep." It tilted its head as if listening. When I returned to Reykjavik that night, Amira was sitting in the cafe near my hotel. She waved me over, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "I booked a flight to Norway," she said. "Next week. I'm scared." I smiled. "That's how you know it's the right direction." She studied me for a moment. "You sound like someone who's already arrived." I didn't know what to say, so I raised my cup in a toast and replied, "To arrivals, wherever they happen." Back in my room, I opened the window despite the cold. The air smelled of snow and sea. I thought of my granddaughter again, her young, assured voice telling me I was too old to travel. I imagined her face if she could see me now, hair tangled, cheeks flushed, notebook full of sketches, heart unburdened. I wondered whether she would understand that this journey wasn't about defiance. It was about remembering the scale of the world and my small but rightful place within it. I didn't hate her for what she'd said. I pitied the narrowness of her imagination. Before bed, I packed my bag for the next day's excursion, a trip to a glacier I had dreamed of since reading about it decades ago. As I zipped the bag, I felt a tremor of anticipation that had nothing to do with fear. I thought of my husband again, his laugh, his restless energy. "You'd like it here," I murmured into the quiet. The lamp cast a pool of light on the wall, and for a moment I imagined he was standing there, smiling that knowing smile that always meant, "Of course you went anyway." I fell asleep with that image still bright in my mind, the hum of the radiator, steady as a heartbeat. The next morning, I boarded the bus to the glacier. As we drove, the world turned white in every direction, the light so pure it felt like forgiveness. I pressed my forehead to the glass and watched the reflection of my face overlay the endless snowfields. I thought about everything I had left unsaid, the years I had spent being smaller than I was meant to be. There, in that wide, silent landscape, I understood that freedom isn't a place you reach. It's a decision you renew every day. When we stepped off the bus and my boots sank into the snow, the air burned in my lungs, and I laughed softly to myself. I wasn't cold. I wasn't lost. I was precisely where I was supposed to be. It began with a phone call I didn't expect, and a voice that instantly pulled me back across the ocean to the small, obedient life I had thought I'd left behind. I was sitting in the hotel lobby, the smell of coffee and damp wool in the air, when my phone started to vibrate. My first impulse was to ignore it. I'd learned over these quiet Icelandic days that silence could be its own form of prayer. But the name glowing on the screen, my son's, had a gravity I couldn't resist. I answered, my hand trembling only slightly. His voice came fast, sharp, brittle, with the kind of anger that pretends to be concern. "Mom, where the hell are you?" he asked. The words, unsoftened by any greeting, cracked the calm I'd built around myself. I told him evenly that I was in Reykjavik, that I was safe, that there was no emergency except the one he was manufacturing. He didn't seem to hear me. "You lied," he said. "You told us you were visiting a friend. Chloe saw your pictures online. What were you thinking? Do you have any idea how worried we've been?" I could almost see his face, forehead creased, mouth tight, eyes narrowed not from fear, but from the insult of my independence. I wanted to tell him that lying had been my only way to breathe, that I'd spent a lifetime asking permission from people who confused love with management. Instead, I said simply, "I'm fine. I needed to do this." He exhaled hard, a sound like disbelief. "Mom, you're 78. What if something happens to you? You can't just disappear." We were ready to call the police. His voice cracked slightly on that last word, and for a moment, I heard the child he used to be, the boy who once clung to my hand in crowded places. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man who saw me as a fragile extension of his own anxiety. I told him again that I was safe, that I had insurance, that I was returning in a few days. There was a long silence, the kind that stretches into judgment. Then softly he said, "You could have told us. We're family." I closed my eyes. "Family isn't ownership," I said. "It's supposed to be connection." He didn't respond. The line went dead. After I hung up, the quiet around me felt different, heavier, as if the air itself disapproved. I sat for a long time staring at the black coffee that had gone cold in front of me. Around me, the lobby buzzed with the small noises of strangers, none of them knowing that an invisible bridge between continents had just cracked. A young couple walked past laughing, their winter hats bright as berries. I envied their uncomplicated joy. When I finally stood up, my legs felt stiff, as though the call had added 10 years to my bones. I went outside, into the snow that was beginning to fall again, soft and relentless. The cold steadied me. The streets were half empty, the air sharp enough to erase thought. I wandered without a destination, following the rhythm of my breath, until I found myself at the edge of the harbor. The sea looked darker than I remembered, almost metallic. The boats rocked gently, their ropes creaking in the wind. I stood there until the tips of my fingers went numb. I thought about my son's anger, his panic disguised as virtue, and realized that for all his talk of worry, what unsettled him most was not the idea of me getting lost, but of me choosing something he didn't control. In his mind, I belonged to a category of people who had finished their adventures. He couldn't understand that the body may age, but the appetite for life doesn't obey the same schedule. That evening, I decided to extend my stay by 2 more days. It was a small rebellion, but a necessary one. When I told the hotel clerk, he smiled and said, "Good choice. The northern lights are stronger this week." I took it as a sign. That night, the sky erupted in green fire, ribbons of light twisting across the darkness. I watched from my window, wrapped in a blanket, tears sliding down my cheeks, not from sadness, but from the sheer enormity of beauty that no camera could contain. For a long time, I stood there, whispering to myself, "Remember this when they call you reckless." The next morning, I joined a small group heading to the hot springs in the countryside. The bus rattled along icy roads, passing through villages that looked like sketches drawn in pencil and snow. The other passengers talked and laughed, their voices warm in the cold air, but I remained quiet, gazing out the window. I could feel the tension of that phone call lingering somewhere beneath my ribs, a tight knot of guilt and defiance. When we arrived, the guide led us down a wooden path that steamed in the cold. The hot spring lay in a hollow surrounded by rocks, the water the color of turquoise glass. I hesitated at the edge, feeling the eyes of the group on me, not unkind, but curious. Then I took off my coat, the cold slicing at my skin, and stepped into the water. It was almost too hot at first, shocking, purifying. I sank in slowly, letting the heat erase the stiffness in my joints, the noise in my head. Beside me, an older Icelandic woman with silver hair and strong shoulders smiled and said something I didn't understand. I shrugged and smiled back. Then she repeated in halting English, "You travel because you are still curious. That keeps you young." Her voice was matter-of-fact, as if she were stating a scientific truth. I laughed softly. "Maybe," I said, "or maybe I travel because I got tired of being told to sit still." She nodded, closing her eyes, and we sat there in companionable silence while steam curled around us like smoke from an invisible fire. When I finally stepped out of the spring, the air hit me like ice, and I felt both fragile and reborn. Later, back at the hotel, I found an email waiting from Chloe. The subject line read, "Please come home." The message was long, full of words that wavered between apology and accusation. She said they were scared something might happen to me, that Dad hadn't slept since my call, that they weren't angry, just worried. She ended with, "You always taught me to be careful, Grandma. I don't understand why you're being so reckless now." I stared at the screen for a long time. It was strange to see my own lessons turned against me. Had I really spent decades teaching caution instead of courage? I wrote back only one line, "I'm not reckless, darling. I'm remembering how to live." Then I closed the laptop and went for a walk before I could start justifying myself. The sky that evening was the color of pewter, and a fine snow fell in slow, deliberate flakes. I wandered into a shop that sold hand-knit scarves and postcards. The woman behind the counter greeted me warmly, and we talked about the weather, about how tourists always came hoping for perfect light. When she asked if I was traveling alone, I said yes, and she didn't flinch or pity me. "Good," she said. "People forget how to be alone." I bought a small woolen hat for Chloe, a ridiculous pink thing with pom-poms, and as I handed over the money, I thought about how love changes shape but not direction. I still wanted to care for them, even as I stepped further from their expectations. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing my son's voice, sharp with fear, and my granddaughter's confusion, and underneath it all, the steady whisper of my own heartbeat saying, "Keep going." Around 2 a.m, I put on my coat and went outside. The streets were deserted, the snow glimmering under the streetlights. I walked to the harbor again, to the same spot where I had first stood on the night I arrived. The sea was restless, waves breaking against the rocks. I thought about all the women I had known who had been told to stay safe, to be reasonable, to let others decide what was too much. My mother had lived that way until the end, shrinking quietly into the corners of her own house. I refused to follow her into that smallness. I whispered her name into the wind and promised her I would not die before living fully. The next day, I received another call, this time from Chloe. Her voice was softer than her father's, hesitant, as if she wasn't sure who would answer. "Grandma?" she said. I smiled despite myself. "I'm here," she exhaled. "You sound happy." There was surprise in her tone, almost disbelief. "I am," I said. "You don't have to worry." She was silent for a moment. "Dad's angry. He says you scared him." "He's scared because he loves me," I said. "But love isn't supposed to be a leash." She didn't respond right away. Then she said, "I guess I just didn't think old people did things like this." I laughed softly. "Neither did I. That's why it was time. She giggled, the sound bright and awkward. Will you show me pictures when you're back? I promised I would. After the call, I sat by the window and looked at the snow falling thicker now, blurring the edges of the world. Something in me unclenched. The anger I'd been carrying toward them, toward years of dismissal and gentle condescension, melted into something lighter, almost pity. They couldn't see past the boundaries of their own fears. I had lived that way once, confusing safety with love, obedience with kindness. It wasn't their fault that they thought protecting me was the same as valuing me. They had never seen an old woman choose her own horizon. The following morning, I packed my things slowly. My flight was in 2 days, but I wanted to spend my last hours not as a tourist, but as a participant in this quiet, radiant world. I went to the cafe by the harbor and wrote postcards to myself. To remember that I was brave, I wrote on one. To remember that fear was a habit, not a truth. On another, I wrote, to remind the girl I once was that she never disappeared. She was waiting. I slipped them into my coat pocket to mail before leaving. That afternoon, the sky cleared, and I decided to walk to the lighthouse at the end of the peninsula. The path was long, the wind fierce, but I moved steadily, one careful step after another. Halfway there, I stopped to catch my breath and looked back at the city, small against the vast sweep of sea and snow. I thought about how strange it was that in running away from my family's version of care, I had found a deeper tenderness in strangers, in landscapes, in solitude itself. The betrayal that had started this journey no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a door. When I reached the lighthouse, the air was so clear I could see the faint shimmer of the aurora already beginning to form. I sat on a rock, my scarf wrapped tight around my face, and whispered a thank you to the cold, to the light, to the fear that had pushed me here. I knew I would have to go home soon, face their worried eyes and their questions, but I also knew I wouldn't be the same woman they had tried to contain. I had stepped outside their narrative of fragility and found another language, one written in wind and water and distance. As I walked back toward the city, the snow began again, soft and slow. Each step left a print that filled almost immediately, as if the earth itself wanted to erase evidence of my passage. But I didn't mind. I carried the proof inside me now, in my lungs, in my pulse, in the way I no longer feared the unknown. When I reached the edge of the harbor, I turned once more to look at the sea. The horizon was invisible, swallowed by weather, but I knew it was there. I whispered to no one and everyone, I'm not done yet. And then I walked home through the falling snow, my heart steady, my path untraceable, but absolutely my own. When I landed back home, the air felt different, heavier somehow, as if the atmosphere itself was skeptical of my return. The airport was loud, full of people rushing toward gates, dragging their lives behind them in neat little suitcases. I moved more slowly, partly because of my age, but mostly because I didn't want to hurry. I had no one waiting at the arrival's gate, no eager face scanning the crowd for mine. That used to make me sad. Now it felt like freedom. The taxi ride from the airport took me through streets I'd known for half a century, yet they looked unfamiliar, as if distance had rearranged their proportions. The same grocery store, the same row of houses, the same faded billboard for some insurance company promising safety and stability. I looked out the window and thought about how much of my life had been spent choosing safety over experience. My own house came into view, sitting at the end of the street like a patient animal, waiting. The driver helped me with my suitcase, and when he left, the silence of my front porch felt almost theatrical, like a stage after the curtain has fallen. Inside, everything was exactly as I had left it. The clock ticked, the air smelled faintly of cedar and lemon polish, and the framed photographs on the mantel regarded me with the stillness of witnesses. I placed my suitcase by the door and sat down on the couch without turning on the lights. For a long moment, I simply listened to the quiet, to the slow settling of the house, to my own heartbeat. I had thought coming home would feel like a return, but it didn't. It felt like stepping into a museum of a life I no longer fully occupied. The walls held my memories, but not my pulse. I realized, sitting there, that the real journey had not been to Iceland. It had been the long, unseen voyage out of invisibility. The phone rang sometime after dusk. I almost ignored it, then picked up. It was my son. His voice was measured, polite, exhausted. "You're home," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Yes," I replied. "I got back this afternoon." A pause. Then, "We saw the photos. Chloe showed me. You really went all over, didn't you?" I heard something in his voice I hadn't expected. Curiosity, maybe even wonder. I said I had, that it was beautiful, that I was glad I went. Another silence, longer this time. Then he said, "You scared us." His tone wasn't angry now. It was small, uncertain. "I know," I said. "That was never my intention." But I needed to remember I could still make choices. He sighed, the sound of someone trying to understand something they've never had to question. "You could have told us," he murmured again. "You wouldn't have let me go," I answered, and we both knew it was true. We talked for a while. Weather, health, trivial things that pretended to be conversation. When we hung up, I felt neither relief nor regret, only clarity. The house seemed to exhale with me. I stood, turned on a lamp, and opened my suitcase. On top of my clothes lay the postcards I'd written to myself, each one bearing a promise. I lined them up on the table and read them aloud, my voice steady. To remember that I was brave, to remember that fear was a habit, not a truth. To remind the girl I once was that she never disappeared. The words felt solid now, like stones I could step across. The next afternoon, Chloe came by. I saw her walking up the path from the window, her shoulders tense, her expression carefully neutral, the way people look when they're rehearsing what to say. When I opened the door, she hesitated, then smiled a little too brightly. "Hi, Grandma," she said. "Dad wanted me to check on you." I could have taken offense at the phrasing, but I didn't. "That's kind of you," I said. "Come in." She stepped inside, looking around as if expecting to find the house altered by my absence. I made tea while she sat at the kitchen table, fidgeting with her phone. The kettle whistled, and I poured the water slowly, deliberately, letting the silence stretch. Finally, she blurted, "You look different." I smiled. "Maybe I am." She watched me carefully as I placed a cup in front of her. "Dad says you shouldn't have gone alone," she said softly. "It wasn't safe." I sat across from her. "Do I look unsafe to you?" She shook her head, embarrassed. "No, but what if something had happened?" I stirred my tea, the spoon clinking against the porcelain. "Something did happen," I said. "I remembered who I am." She looked confused, so I stood and went to the bookshelf, where I had already placed a small framed photo from the trip, the one of me standing before the waterfall, mist rising around me like smoke. I handed it to her. She studied it, her lips parting slightly. "You look happy," she said. I was. I am. We sat in silence for a while, the way people do when the truth is too big to touch. Then she said, "I didn't mean to make you feel old. I didn't want to lose you." I reached across the table and took her hand. You don't lose people by letting them live, I said. You lose them by keeping them small. Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, she was the little girl I used to walk to school, her hand warm and trusting in mine. She squeezed my fingers. I don't want to keep you small, she whispered. Then don't, I said. After she left, I went out to the porch with my cup of tea. The evening light was soft, the air heavy with the scent of the sea. The sky was turning the color of pewter, a southern echo of the Icelandic twilight. I thought about the older woman in the hot spring, her words still echoing. You travel because you are still curious. I smiled to myself. Curiosity had been the first thing I'd lost, and the last thing I'd found again. The neighborhood was quiet, just the distant hum of a lawnmower, the occasional bark of a dog. I realized that nothing outside had changed, yet everything inside me had. That night I unpacked completely, washed my clothes, arranged the souvenirs on the mantel, a small volcanic stone, a postcard of the northern lights, a tiny figurine of a whale carved from driftwood. Each object felt like a piece of proof that I had stepped beyond the boundaries of my family's imagination. Before going to bed, I sat at my desk and began writing a letter to Chloe. I told her about the people I had met, the woman with the groceries who drew me a map, the tour guide with the red scarf, Amira with her wild laughter, the woman in the hot spring who reminded me that curiosity is its own form of youth. I described the landscape, the light that never quite went dark, the silence that taught me to listen differently. But mostly, I wrote about the moment I realized that I no longer needed permission to exist. You will understand one day, I wrote at the end. When the world tells you to shrink, you will remember that you come from a woman who refused. I signed it, sealed it, and placed it on her photo on the mantel. The following morning, I took a walk to the shore. The ocean was calm, its surface smooth as glass. I sat on a bench and breathed in the salt air, the wind teasing at my hair. I thought of my husband, of how he used to stand with his arms wide, claiming the wind like it was an ally. For the first time in years, I felt him beside me, not as a ghost of loss, but as a witness to my return to myself. I whispered, I made it, love, and the waves answered with a low murmur that sounded almost like approval. When I got home, there was a text from Chloe. It was short, uncertain. Will you teach me how to pack light? I want to go somewhere I've never been. I laughed out loud, a sound that startled even me. I texted back, start with comfortable shoes and unreasonable hope. Then I put down the phone and sat by the window, watching the light shift across the floor. Evening came slowly, and as the sky darkened, I opened the window to let the cool air in. Somewhere in the distance, a train passed, its low rumble vibrating through the quiet house. I thought about all the moments in my life when I had mistaken quiet for peace. True peace, I realize now, wasn't stillness. It was movement without fear. The house no longer felt like a museum. It felt like a harbor, a place to rest between voyages. Before bed, I took out my journal and wrote one last entry for this chapter of my life. I didn't go away to prove them wrong, I wrote. I went to remember that I was right about myself. I closed the book and sat for a long while in the dark, the window open, the night air touching my face like a benediction. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the aurora was shimmering again, unseen but alive, and I knew that, whether I ever saw it again or not, it was part of me now. I turned off the lamp, and the room filled with the quiet rhythm of my breathing. The world outside continued in its ordinary way. The waves, the wind, the trains, the distant lives of strangers. But inside, something vast had settled. It wasn't victory or triumph. It was truth. I had traveled far enough to meet the woman I had once been, and she had welcomed me back without hesitation. The last thing I remember before sleep took me was a feeling not of ending, but of beginning, an understanding that freedom, once tasted, can never be forgotten. The days that followed slipped into a rhythm that felt both familiar and new, as if I were relearning the contours of my own life. The house was the same creak in the floorboards, the same sound of the mail slot clattering in the morning, but I inhabited it differently now, lighter, quieter inside. I woke each day without that dull ache of waiting for someone to call, without the habitual scan of absence. I made my coffee slowly, savoring the smell, and sat by the window watching the sea breathe against the rocks. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel invisible in my own life. The silence that used to sting now felt like an open space, a room where my thoughts could stretch without bumping into other people's worries. Sometimes I found myself touching the small souvenirs from Iceland, as if to confirm that I hadn't imagined it. The stone from the black beach lay cool in my hand, smooth and heavy. I would roll it between my palms and feel the memory of wind and salt against my skin. On the windowsill, the little figurine of the whale caught the light each morning, its curved back gleaming softly like a secret I had brought home. I kept my journal on the table, open to the last page, so that its final words could remind me each day that remembering who you are is not an achievement, but a practice. There were moments when doubt still visited, as it always does, the small quiet voice asking if I had been selfish, if I had frightened them too much, if perhaps they had been right to worry. But even those questions no longer hurt. They were like old songs I could listen to without believing. Chloe called often now, and our conversations were different, less guarded, more curious. She asked questions that surprised me: what the air smelled like near the glacier, whether the sea really glowed at night, if I had ever been afraid. I told her the truth, that yes, I had been afraid almost every day, but that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's deciding that something else matters more. Sometimes she would just listen, quiet on the other end of the line, and I would hear in her silence the beginning of understanding. One afternoon, she told me she'd booked a short trip with a friend from college, her first time traveling without her parents. "You inspired me," she said, almost shyly. I felt a warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with pride. It was recognition, the faint echo of continuity. I told her to pack light and leave room for wonder. My son visited a week later, alone. I could see the effort it took for him to come, without his usual armor of authority. He brought groceries and a bouquet of white lilies, flowers I had always liked. We made dinner together, something simple, and as we ate, he told me about his work, about Chloe's plans, about how the house had felt too quiet when I was gone. When he finally looked up, his eyes were softer than I remembered. "I think I understand why you went," he said. I smiled, not needing him to explain further. "I didn't go to run away," I said. "I went to arrive somewhere I'd been missing." He nodded slowly. "I was scared," he admitted. "That's all." I reached across the table and touched his hand. "I know," I said. Fear makes us forget that other people are still alive inside themselves. It wasn't forgiveness we shared that evening, but something more useful: comprehension. After he left, the night wrapped around the house with its usual calm. I walked out onto the porch, the air cool and heavy with the scent of the ocean. Above me, the sky was wide and indifferent, a canvas of faint stars. I thought about all the women I had known who never allowed themselves to stand in such solitude, women who folded themselves into the lives of others until they vanished completely. I felt their presence then, not as ghosts, but as witnesses. The world had told them, as it once told me, that their stories were finished before they even began. But I knew better now. Stories don't end with age. They simply change tempo. That night I couldn't sleep, so I sat at my desk and wrote one last letter, not to anyone in particular, perhaps to whoever might find it one day. I wrote about how it is possible to disappear in the middle of your own life and still find your way back, how silence can be both a prison and a sanctuary, depending on whether you claim it or it claims you. I wrote that love is not always gentle, that sometimes it arrives dressed as worry, as advice, as fear, and that you must learn to separate its true face from its disguises. I wrote that freedom doesn't mean leaving everything behind. It means returning to what you love without apology. When I finished, I folded the letter neatly and slipped it into the back of my journal. The next morning, I walked down to the shore. The tide was low, the sand damp and cold under my shoes. I stood at the edge of the water, breathing in the salt, and thought of the northern lights, the way they moved, soundless and defiant, painting the darkness as if to remind the world that beauty belongs to no age. I closed my eyes and felt that same pulse inside me, slower now but steady. Behind me, the gulls screamed, impatient and alive. I whispered to them, "I'm still here," and it felt like a vow. On the walk back, I passed a young couple arguing softly near the pier. The woman looked upset, the man exasperated, and for a moment I saw my younger self in her face, eager to please, terrified of losing love by asserting desire. I wanted to tell her that you don't save love by making yourself smaller, that people who truly see you will never need you to shrink. But I said nothing. Some lessons can't be given. They must be discovered. I made myself a fresh cup of coffee, set it beside the small pile of travel mementos, and opened my journal again. I added one last sentence beneath the others. Peace is not the absence of longing. It's learning to walk with it without complaint. The words came easily, like something I had always known but forgotten to say aloud. Later, as the afternoon faded into the gold of early evening, I sat by the window and watched the horizon. Somewhere, far to the north, the sky would soon begin to shimmer again. The same lights that had watched over me that first night in Iceland. I imagined them spreading across the world, unseen but steady, and I smiled, feeling strangely connected to everything, the sea, the air, the girl I once was, the woman I had become. I understood then that the trip had not ended when I came home. It would continue in every step I took, every choice I made to remain awake in my own life. When the last light faded and the room fell into that soft blue darkness I love, I whispered a quiet message to whoever might need it one day. You are never too old to begin again. The world will wait for you to remember. Then I closed my eyes, not in weariness, but in quiet awe, and let the sound of the waves become my lullaby, endless, patient, eternal.